Saint-Lô, Normandy, 0520, 24 August 1944. The hedgerows sweat a white mist. Dew slicks the nettles. The air tastes of wet loam and faint cordite. Through Zeiss 10x50 field glasses, scouts of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division fix on a hard outline, a file of American M4 Shermans, roughly 30 tons each with 75mm guns, crouched hull down along a hedge, turret rings catching the first light. A battalion. The note goes into the log, and men steel themselves for the coming engine growl, the metallic bite of track pins, the oil-heavy breath of advancing armor. But the valley stays unnervingly quiet. No throb, no clatter, only larks lifting from the damp grass and the distant cough of a single truck. By late morning, a Luftwaffe photo run skims the bocage. The line appears unchanged, statues at the field's edge. In early afternoon, a patrol noses forward and finds the absence of war. No churned ruts, no spalled divots, no scalloped track bites in the clay. Only a crosshatch of light truck tires, a torn strip of rubberized fabric snagged on hawthorn, and the sweet-sour trace of vulcanized rubber lingering in the humid air. Oberstleutnant Hermann Noack feels disbelief climb his neck like cold water. Messages to Heeresgruppe B reach for a phrase that does not invite ridicule: Geistertanks, ghost tanks. What he had watched was air-shaped like armor. The Shermans were inflatables, rubberized shells, roughly 150 pounds apiece, raised in minutes by hissing compressors and a practiced crew. Behind them worked a unit new to France, the U.S. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later nicknamed the Ghost Army, fusing rubber, scripted radio traffic, and disciplined vehicle movement to conjure divisions that did not exist. How that craft operated, who the men were, what tools they carried, and how they timed each illusion would dictate the next German march order, and the hesitation that followed. England, autumn 1943. The chill fog clung to the hedgerows around Salisbury Plain, where war was being reimagined not in steel, but in canvas and air. Long before Normandy, the Allies' deception campaign took root in a world of draftsmen, painters, and engineers working quietly in makeshift workshops. The spark had come from across the desert in North Africa, where Brigadier Dudley Clarke's elusive "a force" had turned deception into a science. Clarke's team had fooled the Africa Corps before El Alamein by sculpting illusions: wooden tanks mounted on jeeps, dummy fuel dumps that shimmered under the sun, and fake convoys moving by night. Operation Bertram had taught the Allies a vital truth: control what the enemy sees, and you control what he does. As the invasion of Europe loomed, those same principles crossed the Channel. British deception experts briefed American planners on camouflage, false radio chatter, and the choreography of deceit. Out of this collaboration came an audacious experiment: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated in January 1944 under Colonel Harry L. Reeder. Numbering barely 100 men, they were no ordinary soldiers. Many were artists from New York's Pratt Institute, sound engineers from Bell Labs, and theater set designers who once painted Broadway backdrops. Now their stage was the Western Front, and their props were made to fool Panzer divisions. Factories in New Jersey and Pennsylvania began turning out strange cargo: life-sized rubber inflatables of M4 Shermans, M10 tank destroyers, and two 1-2-ton trucks. Each could be lifted by 4 men, inflated by an air compressor in 20 minutes, and arranged in perfect formation under the dim light of dawn. From a distance, through a German officer's binoculars, they were indistinguishable from real armor. Art and engineering had fused into a weapon system. The Ghost Army's creation marked a new frontier in warfare, one where illusion dictated movement and silence shouted louder than guns. Europe, unaware, was about to meet an army made of shadows. Early 1944 found Allied workshops humming with a single strange specification: make combat look real without a single kilogram of armor. In sequence, engineers drafted patterns, factory foremen in New Jersey and Pennsylvania cut rubberized fabric, and the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, an embattled corps inside the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops translated drawings into deployable deception. Their inflatable M4A3 Sherman replicas were more than painted balloons. Built over a collapsible aluminum frame and fitted with reinforced air valves, they measured roughly 19 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 9 feet tall when fully pressurized, dimensions kept intentionally within an inch of the real vehicle, so silhouettes and turret rings matched optical recognition charts used by German spotters. The shells themselves weighed little. Reports and surviving inventories list individual decoys in the neighborhood of 90 to 150 pounds, light enough for 4 men and a field compressor to handle, heavy enough to resist a gust and a foxhole's edge. Assembly became choreography. Portable gasoline-driven air compressors, standard issue to the Camouflage Engineers, could inflate a Sherman's skin in 20 minutes. Crews practiced drills that allowed 50 decoys to be raised, positioned, and masked in under half an hour. Structural realism extended beyond shape. Collapsible mock barrels, painted stowage boxes, and rubberized skid plates mimicked shadows and highlights at range. To leave convincing evidence of motion, roller teams pressed wooden tire pattern molds into mud, creating convoluted track work that mapped plausible approach lanes. Smoke pots and small combustion units exhaled diesel sweet plumes to emulate idling radiators. Canvas tarps and jerry cans were arranged to suggest fuel dumps. Deception required voice and sound. The 3132 Signal Service Company scripted and transmitted authentic-sounding radio nets, while sound technicians, some recruited from Bell Labs and theatrical industries, played recorded tracks of engines, gear clanks, and distant gun reports through trailer-mounted loudspeakers. In practice, the auditory layer could carry 100 meters farther than a visual silhouette under a fogged dawn. German scouts sometimes reported engine noise without heat signatures or the smell of exhaust with no visible tracks, small contradictions that seeded doubt in command logs. The real test, however, would not be in a Pennsylvania workshop, but in the muddy lanes and bocage of Normandy. There, the deception's mettle would be measured against Wehrmacht scouts' experience and suspicion. St. Lo, Normandy, 27th of June, 1944. The hedgerows steamed under a pale noon sun, the fields heavy with the stench of mud, crushed nettle, and spent cordite. For the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this was the moment their art would meet war. The Allied landings were barely 3 weeks old, and the front was still a tangled web of resistance. Patton's real armor was maneuvering elsewhere, but to German observers it needed to appear massed here, poised for a drive south toward Coutances. Under the camouflage of mist and engine smoke, the Ghost Army went to work. Along narrow Norman lanes, crews from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers unrolled rubberized fabric, pumping life into deflated shapes until rows of M4 Shermans stood shoulder to shoulder. The olive-drab skins shimmered with dew, turret rings reflecting light like real steel. Signal teams from the 3132 Signal Service Company erected dummy radio masts and began transmitting scripted traffic, call signs, map coordinates, and coded chatter identical to those used by the real 6th Armored Division. Nearby, Bell Labs sound engineers queued up their massive amplifiers, releasing an eerie industrial chorus. Engines revving, gearboxes grinding, and treads crunching over gravel. Even the smell was right. Diesel smoke poured from concealed generators to mimic idling tanks. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes, circling miles above, photographed what seemed to be an armored buildup stretching half a mile. The images reached the 116th Panzer Division headquarters by nightfall. Within hours, orders redirected men and fuel toward St. Lo to block an American thrust that would never come. For 48 critical hours, the deception froze enemy armor in place, giving Patton's real columns the corridor they needed to sweep unopposed toward Coutances. When German patrols finally reached the supposed assembly area, they found collapsed husks and discarded air hoses. One officer later wrote that he could not comprehend how such things existed, a line of tanks made of nothing but wind. The illusion had held long enough to alter the battlefield's rhythm. The Ghost Army had proved that belief itself could become a weapon, and the war of shadows was only beginning. Caen, Early July 1944. The front had stabilized into a murderous stalemate of hedgerows and artillery. Duels when the first rumors filtered through German field posts. Talk of unmanned armor, tanks that neither moved nor burned. Patrols from the 352nd Infantry Division sent back sketches of what they called Luftpanzer, air tanks, claiming to have found rubber carcasses where Allied armor had once stood. Reports from captured radio intercepts spoke of ghost transmissions, perfectly encoded but leading nowhere. The words reached the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht with an air of disbelief. Intelligence analysts in Paris initially filed the claims under false reconnaissance, an understandable error, they thought, from jittery men exhausted by constant Allied pressure. But the contradictions multiplied. Luftwaffe aerial photography, taken days apart, showed entire armored columns forming and dissolving overnight. At least 3 separate analysts attested to the accuracy of the images, forcing a reluctant reassessment. General Günther Blumentritt of Army Group B convened a special review of the intelligence chain, concluding that enemy deception methods have reached a sophistication unprecedented in this war. He issued new orders. Every major sighting of Allied armor was to be confirmed by ground patrol before redeployment. In theory, it added rigor. In practice, it added delay. Commanders now hesitated to move reserves, awaiting confirmations that never arrived. The effect rippled down to the line. German soldiers began referring to the phenomenon in bitter humor as Luftpanzer, half mocking, half fearful. Prisoners taken later by U.S. units confessed to deep confusion. Some convinced that the Americans had discovered a new form of magnetic camouflage, others whispering of secret gases that bent light. Allied psychological warfare units recorded those interrogations with quiet satisfaction. Disbelief had curdled into doubt. Every hour the Wehrmacht spent debating the reality of rubber battalions was an hour lost in the real war of movement. As the Allies pushed toward the Seine, the German High Command found itself shadowboxing an enemy that could vanish at will. Proof that illusion, once seated in the mind, could erode an army's will faster than artillery. Akron, Ohio, once known for tires and weather balloons, had, by 1944, become the beating heart of an invisible army. Beneath the clatter of presses and the tang of hot rubber, workers at the U.S. Rubber Company and Goodyear were not making life rafts anymore. They were building illusions. Under layers of classified paperwork, these factories produced thousands of inflatable tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces, each one destined to fight a war it would never actually touch. The scale was staggering. A single M4 Sherman decoy consumed nearly 200 square feet of rubberized cloth, reinforced with stitched seams and aluminum framing, yet required fewer than 8 man-hours to fabricate from start to finish. Efficiency was the secret weapon. Once folded, each decoy could fit into a standard wooden crate measuring barely 6 feet long and could be loaded by hand onto a 212-ton truck. The Quartermaster Corps labeled the shipments blandly as engineering equipment or bridge components, concealing their purpose from port clerks and even some field officers. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers managed the logistics, ensuring the boxes flowed through embarkation depots in New York, Boston, and Liverpool with the same precision as genuine tanks. By autumn 1944, more than 1,200 inflatable vehicles, Shermans, M10s, and even 155mm howitzers were in the inventory of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, enough to conjure an entire Phantom Corps at will. This quiet industrial miracle underscored a truth that Germany could no longer match. Production was power, even when the product was air. Allied factories could replace illusion as swiftly as they forged steel, while German industry, strangled by bombing and shortages, could not afford such creative luxuries. Each new shipment of rubber armor widened the psychological gap. The battlefield had become an extension of the assembly line, and the next test of this industrial mirage would unfold on the banks of the Rhine, where deception itself would cross the river first. Bettembourg, Luxembourg, 12th September 1944. Dawn broke under a low ceiling of smoke and drizzle, the air thick with the scent of wet wheat and diesel. To passing villagers, the scene looked like a massive American buildup. Convoys rumbling along muddy roads, mechanics shouting over engines, tanks parked in rows beneath camouflage nets. Yet the spectacle was made of air and artifice. This was the Ghost Army's most elaborate performance to date, an entire division conjured from rubber and sound. Their orders were simple but audacious: make the Germans believe that the U.S. 28th Infantry Division had arrived in force near the Moselle River, when in truth, the real unit was repositioning far to the north. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops rolled into place under cover of night. In just hours, more than 350 inflatable Shermans, half-tracks, and supply trucks filled the fields around Bettembourg. Dummy artillery barrels crafted from painted stovepipes jutted from earthen berms. Camouflage engineers laid out phony ammunition dumps and vehicle parks, their geometry designed to match reconnaissance photos of genuine U.S. encampments. Sign painters marked intersections with 28th INF Div HQ arrows, while soldiers switched insignia on their uniforms, new patches sewn hastily onto sleeves that morning. Signal teams broadcast steady streams of encrypted chatter, the 31 seconds loudspeakers adding the low mechanical growl of a division preparing for battle. From the air, it worked perfectly. Luftwaffe Reconnaissance reported heavy concentrations of Allied armor massing along the Moselle, prompting the 47th Panzer Corps to halt its planned counterattack and await reinforcements that would never come. When German patrols finally approached the area days later, they found limp, deflated husks of fabric and twisted air valves scattered across the mud. Some soldiers joked darkly about automatic self-deflating armor, unable to grasp the scale of the illusion that had stalled their advance. For the men of the Ghost Army, the victory was quiet but immense. They had risked capture and execution as spies to buy the Allies precious time. Yet even as they packed their rubber tanks back into crates, they knew the final act still waited beyond the Moselle, the crossing of the Rhine, where illusion itself would lead the way into Germany. Rheinberg, Germany, 20th of March, 1945. The night air over the Rhine was cold and metallic, carrying the tang of fuel, wet earth, and distant artillery. Allied searchlights licked across low clouds, tracing the outlines of pontoon bridges that didn't exist. On the western bank, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were preparing their grandest illusion, Operation Viersen. The task was monumental: to convince German command that the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were massing near Rheinberg for a major river crossing, while General William Simpson's real 9th Army prepared to strike elsewhere. Within 48 hours, the Ghost Army transformed empty farmland into what looked like an invasion staging ground. More than 600 inflatable vehicles, Shermans, half-tracks, and trucks rose from the fields like a phantom convoy. Over 500 dummy artillery emplacements dotted the banks, their barrels fashioned from painted pipes and sand-filled canvas. Engineers dug fake foxholes and command posts, while radio teams filled the ether with orchestrated chatter, authentic call signs, encoded logistics reports, and frantic bridge construction updates that mimicked the communications of a full corps preparing to move. From across the river, German spotters of the 84th Infantry Division saw exactly what the Allies intended: floodlights, smoke plumes, and columns of armor assembling under camouflage nets. Overhead reconnaissance confirmed substantial American concentrations along the sector. To make the illusion complete, sound engineers from the 3132nd played recordings of hammering, chain rattling, and the echoing groan of pontoon bridge construction, sounds that carried eerily across the misted water. Convinced of an imminent assault, German commanders diverted reinforcements south to face the phantom divisions. When the true 9th Army crossed the Rhine 15 miles north 2 days later, resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. Post-war interrogations revealed the depth of the deception. German officers confessed they had been completely deceived by the phantom buildup at Rheinberg. Operation Viersen stood as the Ghost Army's masterpiece, a symphony of illusion conducted on industrial scale. Yet as victory loomed, its authors remained anonymous, their existence locked away in classified files. They had helped win the war with nothing but air, paint, and sound, and no one would know for nearly half a century. Germany, April 1945. The front was dissolving into fragments, platoons retreating through villages without orders, radios crackling with static instead of strategy. Yet more corrosive than defeat was doubt. Months of Allied deception had hollowed the Wehrmacht's confidence from within. Field commanders no longer trusted the maps in their hands or the intelligence briefings on their desks. Reports arrived describing phantom divisions materializing overnight, armored columns that evaporated by morning, and American formations appearing in two places at once. Reconnaissance officers debated their own photographs, afraid to distinguish between shadow and steel. The psychological toll deepened daily. Soldiers in the West joked bitterly that the Allies could make tanks from clouds, while staff officers began attaching caveats to every field report, unverified, possibly decoy. For a command system built on precision, such uncertainty was lethal. Counterattacks slowed. Reserves hesitated. Units that might once have fought to the last shell now surrendered preemptively, convinced they were encircled by forces that existed only on paper. In one sector near the Ruhr, 2 battalions laid down their arms after mistaking inflated artillery dummies and false radio traffic for an entire armored corps. Captured officers admitted later that fear had replaced logic. "We no longer fought armies," one lieutenant told Allied interrogators. "We fought shadows." The collapse of faith in their own perception, an unseen fracture, spread faster than any tank offensive. For the Allies, the results were measurable. Thinner resistance, delayed redeployments, and faster territorial gains wherever deception had preceded assault. By spring's end, the Wehrmacht was not only outgunned, but outthought. The Ghost Army's illusions had evolved into a weapon of the mind, dissolving certainty itself. Yet behind each mirage stood men still moving through danger and secrecy, waging a war whose victories could never be announced. By April 1945, the results of the Allies' deception warfare were no longer anecdotal, they were quantifiable. At SHAEF headquarters, analysts compiled after-action reports from across the Western Front and found a pattern. Wherever the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops operated, German response times slowed dramatically. On average, enemy countermeasures lagged by 36 hours, an eternity in mechanized warfare. Those lost hours allowed genuine armored and infantry divisions to reposition, cross rivers, or strike exposed flanks unopposed. It was a victory measured not in territory, but in hesitation. Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, both veterans of deception planning since North Africa, quietly acknowledged the 23rd's strategic worth. Though their names never appeared in communiques, the ghosts had become an unspoken component of Allied doctrine, a psychological counterpart to artillery barrages and air superiority. More than 20 large-scale operations had been executed across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Each mission followed a disciplined formula: false armor, scripted radio chatter, staged logistics, and sonic misdirection. Together, these illusions shaped campaigns from the Brittany Peninsula to the Ruhr Pocket, siphoning enemy armor from key battlefields and saving thousands of Allied lives that might otherwise have been lost in frontal assaults. For the first time, deception was treated as a legitimate branch of military art. The war had revealed that confusion could be weaponized with the same precision as steel. In the ruins of the Reich, Wehrmacht survivors spoke of their paralysis, how every new column of tanks might be real or might be air. That uncertainty eroded their will to fight long before the final surrender. The Ghost Army's triumph was therefore twofold. It protected Allied soldiers on the ground, and it redefined the meaning of warfare itself. Victory, by 1945, was not just about who fired first, but about who was believed. Near the Rhine, April 1945, the last illusions were collapsing. Under the gray drizzle, men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved silently through soggy fields, deflating their rubber tanks, folding up the fabric that had once deceived an empire. For months, they had lived a paradox. Soldiers without firepower, artists disguised as warriors, risking death to project illusions. Their success had saved lives, yet every mission carried the quiet terror of discovery. Under Article 68 of the German Military Code, deceptive impersonation was espionage, punishable by summary execution. A captured Ghost Army operative could expect no mercy, no prisoner of war protections. Secrecy was their only armor. Bill Blass, the future fashion designer, later recalled lying awake in the blacked-out nights of Luxembourg, listening to German artillery shells thud into the decoy camps they had built that afternoon. Ellsworth Kelly, who would one day paint minimalist canvases, remembered the hiss of inflating Shermans beside the sound of real ones burning a few miles away. They were unarmed, carrying little more than carbines, yet always positioned close enough to the front that a single patrol could expose them. The strain of pretending to be an army, of living inside a perpetual performance, took its toll. They endured the whine of incoming rounds, the loss of comrades, and the loneliness of a war fought in silence. When victory finally came, the men packed away their canvas corps and air hoses. No medals awaited them, no public acknowledgments. Their war would remain sealed behind classification stamps for decades. Yet their contribution had altered the very geometry of conflict. They had shown that imagination could shield soldiers as effectively as armor, and that deception, born of creativity, not cruelty, could end battles before they began. Amid the smoldering ruins of Europe, their deflated tanks lay as quiet testaments to the strange humanity that survived inside the machinery of war. May 1945 brought silence to Europe. The guns along the Rhine went still, and with them faded the quiet war of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their final decoy camps were dismantled, the last inflatables packed into crates and marked for disposal. No parades or citations followed. Within weeks, the Ghost Army was formally disbanded, its personnel scattered into civilian life. The men carried their memories like sealed sketches, stories they could not tell, operations that officially never happened. Their records were buried under layers of classification, and for half a century, even their families knew nothing of what they had done. When those files were finally declassified in 1996, the truth astonished historians. The quiet unit of artists, sound engineers, and radio men had waged more than 20 deception campaigns that altered the course of the war. Veterans, now gray-haired, spoke of the strange pride and isolation of serving in a force denied recognition. Their innovations did not die with them. The techniques they pioneered, false radio nets, sonic deception, rapid camouflage deployment, became the foundation for Cold War-era psychological operations and NATO field exercises. Even into the digital age, their legacy echoed through doctrines of information warfare, where perception itself became the battlefield. Today, exhibitions and documentaries honor their ingenuity. The inflatable tank, once an oddity of rubber and paint, stands as a symbol of intellect triumphing over brute force. It reminds the world that in modern conflict, victory is not only about firepower, but about belief, about shaping what the enemy thinks is true. As nations rebuilt from the wreckage, the legacy of those unarmed illusionists endured, proof that imagination, in humanity's darkest hour, could still change the course of history. Spring, 1946. Across Europe, fields once gouged by tanks began to bloom again. Yet scattered among the wildflowers lay remnants of a quieter war, torn seams of rubber, twisted valves, and scraps of canvas mottled in fading olive drab. Farmers in Normandy and along the Rhine unearthed these relics while plowing new soil, pausing to wonder how such weightless ghosts had once terrified entire divisions. To them, the fragments were curiosities. To history, they were the remains of an army built on imagination. For the men who had created those illusions, the memories lingered with a peculiar ache. They had fought not with bullets but with air, risking their lives for victories that could never be spoken of. Their unit had been erased from the record books, their missions buried beneath the official histories of steel and fire. Yet the deflated shells left behind told another story, one of courage measured not in destruction but in deception. What had begun as a desperate wartime experiment had matured into one of the greatest tactical illusions in military history. In the decades that followed, The legend of the Ghost Army grew quietly, rediscovered piece by piece, until its truth could no longer be ignored. Their work proved that wars are not won solely by the strongest arm or the heaviest tank, but by the sharpest mind. Amid the ruins of Europe, the last illusion endured, not of armor or sound, but of humanity's boundless capacity to turn creativity into survival.